Usually there are two kinds of recognized gameplay structure, which are either linear or more non-linear. Non-linear games are often seen as a sort of open world game, or somewhere in between linear and open world. But as it's possible for non-linear games not to be open world, I wanted to see if we could find a better word to describe games that fall somewhere in between. Looking online, I saw a lot of games being called semi-open world or somewhat linear, so in this video I'm primarily thinking about games that fall into that kind of gray zone. That's how I came up with the idea for another kind of gameplay structure, which I've decided to call nodular gameplay structure. Before I get into an explanation of what I see as nodular structure, let's first dive into what we mean specifically by linear or open world structure. Linear gameplay structure is of course best visualized as a line. It has a beginning and an end, and along that line there are many stops that function as checkpoints or stages or levels which unlock the rest of the game to access. A game that fits into this perfect linear structure would be something like Mega Man, or Sonic the Hedgehog, or Super Mario World. The linear structure can be elaborated upon by adding other routes which a player can take, although the overall structure from beginning to end usually remains unchanged. If anything does change significantly, it's more likely to be near the end of the game, rather than in the middle, as changing the whole structure of the second half of the game is a lot more work than adding other endings. An open world game, on the other hand, is best visualized not as a line, but as a circle, wherein different linear threads of storyline take place. Usually they're only tentatively connected so that you can do them in any order, you engage with them, and then they sink away again back into the texture of the world. Obviously, a great example of this would be Breath of the Wild, but linear games can also make use of the open world design concept, and frequently do so, for example in the PS1 Final Fantasy games. Let me explain what I mean. Final Fantasy VII starts off as a linear gameplay experience, and for most of the game, it is. But parts of the game, especially near the end, open up, usually giving players access to a spaceship or a boat, allowing them to explore the world freely before closing it up again to continue the narrative and bring it to a conclusion. Most games I can think of are variations of the linear structure or the open world structure. But I want to suggest the existence of a third kind of gameplay structure that I mentioned earlier in the video, which I call nodular gameplay structure. Nodular gameplay structure is defined by the node, which in gameplay terms is usually called a hub world. The node is an area that gives players access to other explorable areas. However, at the start of the game, these places may be inaccessible or have nothing to do in them before completing actions in other areas. A good example of this kind of game is Demon's Souls. As you can see, it has a hub world and various minor nodes to which it's connected. However, nodular games are not just games that have hub worlds. I think Ocarina of Time actually has nodular gameplay structure. The player begins in a minor node, Kokiri Village, before advancing to the major node. When the player reaches the major node, they have access to other minor nodes and activities to do there, but the game still retains a somewhat linear narrative by restricting access or restricting activities in the various minor nodes. In this kind of game, the player usually sees more changes to the world as they interact with it. Another example of nodular gameplay structure is Ys 8 and Ys 9. In Ys 8, the major node is actually just the tiny castaway village. But in Ys 9, there is actually a major node, the city, and as Adol levels up and gains new abilities, access is given to other minor nodes branching off of it. In this way, Ys 9 can tell a tight, linear narrative while giving players a sense of freedom, and I think it's this balance that's unique to nodular gameplay structure. You can also see this kind of structure utilized in Jak and Daxter, which allows the player to explore the island while using item collection to keep a tight control on what areas the player can or cannot access. Jak and Daxter specifically incorporates more than one major node, starting the player off at the major node of Jak's home island, giving access to its minor nodes, before allowing the player to pass on via your motorbike to the next major node and its own string of minor nodes. Although I love open world games as much as the next person, I do sometimes crave something with a bit more structure. I find nodular gameplay structure to be a really great balance between the limitless freedom of open world structure and the on-the-rails experience of linear structure. What kind of gameplay structure do you typically enjoy the most? What kind of experiments would you like to see with these structures? Let me know down in the comments to start a conversation.